Hello and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We do have a great guest tonight and a really great topic that we haven't been able to hit on much, but because it's a heavy topic and it's a difficult topic. It is child sex trafficking. This is a topic that's been very much in the news or chatter because of Sound of Freedom. And tonight we do have someone who's been on the ground fighting child sex trafficking around the world, Leigh Dundas. She's a human rights attorney. She got started in this about 10 years ago. She has been literally helping stop this terrible practice, and she has been rescuing children from brothels, and she has an absolutely fascinating story. So we are going to be talking to Leigh. She's going to be giving us insight into the things that she saw. She's going to be talking to us about, the on the ground stuff, but also how they've been able to crack down on child sex trafficking, the tactics to stop the practice entirely, what works. She's going to be talking to us about that tonight. So, really excited for this conversation. And I do hope that you stick around for all of it, even though it is difficult. I understand to sit through this, but I do think it's super important. So I hope you stick with us tonight. But before we get to Leigh, let me tell you about Genucel. If you look in the mirror and you see dark spots, I know we all do as we age, especially, or if you've been in the sun a lot, the good news is you can get rid of them. We all spent way too much time in the sun as kids, and we're getting older, so those spots are just creeping up on us. If you use Genucel's incredible dark spot corrector, they can be a thing of the past. The dark spot corrector has 3 cutting-edge ingredients that go to work fast on sunspots, dark spots, liver spots, and even old discoloration, both on your face and your hands. And you're going to be amazed at how quickly you see results. And with Genucel, you'll see the results or your money back, no questions asked. So how do you get it? Well, you go to genucel.com/Kim to get your dark spot corrector with the new Genucel's most popular package, which has other great products like their Ultra Retinol Moisturizer, which has a powerful retinol alternative that's safe to use in the summer sun, because a lot of times you can't use any sort of retinol products if you're going to be out in the sun. And so a lot of people stop using it in the summer, but you don't have to with Genucel's products. And retinol is some of the best stuff you can use on your skin to keep those wrinkles away. So you can save over 70% off when you go to the special link, genucel.com/Kim. You're also going to get free shipping and free returns on all orders. And the order will also include a mystery luxury gift while supplies last. So again, it's genucel.com/Kim. Go grab it today. All right, let's get on with the show. Leigh, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here today.
So this is a topic that a lot of people are really focused on. Interestingly, it seems like it's unfortunately become politicized, which is, I think, really, really unfortunate. Are you getting the sense that this is a politicized topic?
Yeah, it is. I mean, much like you, I've been working in the field for a long time. I started actually working in the human trafficking, anti-trafficking arena back in 2013. And back then, the only people talking about the issue really were some faith leaders who were seeing it, on the street, if they were out on the street helping, and law enforcement, DAs, prosecutors, the occasional forward-thinking politician. Now, of course, with the release of Sound of Freedom, it's getting a lot of media play, a lot of talk. And like any good topic, the bad guys are going to try to discredit it by writing it off as being a this or a that or a right wing or a left wing or whatever the
Yeah.
common way to discredit something is. But it is becoming politicized. But the upside of that is it's getting attention, and you know the rule: there's no such thing as bad press. So
Yeah, I suppose. I suppose it's just that this is such an odd topic to be politicized. Yet I think with, like Pizzagate or Q or whatever, that is QAnon. Is that what is that what it's
yeah,
called? The organ.
I think
I don't follow
I'm
anyway, so I don't know.
I'm constantly accused of being part of it, and I don't even know
Okay.
what it is or what it means, like
Right. I
you.
don't.
But yeah, I think it's QAnon.
Yeah, I'm
I
like, how
think
do you find this place? Like, who's Q? Where do you get these messages? I still can't figure it out. And I'm a investigative journalist in a lot of ways.
right.
I
Yeah.
can't find Q. So, but because of that, because I do think that the people who are supposedly QAnon conspiracy theorists, they talk a lot about child. I think they talk a lot about pedophilia more than anything, right? So this seems to have become somehow a divisive, politicized topic. How did you get? So you're an attorney.
Yeah.
What is your background as an attorney? Were you always like a human rights attorney, or were you doing something else before you got into this?
No, I wanted to be a dolphin trainer, and I remember distinctly in 8th grade, our career ed teacher saying, "You have plenty of time to figure out what you're going to do with your life and pick a major." But I got invited to take a test where I scored apparently really well on the verbal section. I bombed the math, but they allowed me to start college based on that test, and so I was picking a major pretty quickly after that 8th grade class. And dolphin training wasn't a major, thank God, at my college. But I ended up, long story short, going to college from 14 to 17, and then
Wow.
applying to law schools because I don't like science and math. So med school was not really a proper lane for me to be in, given my skill sets. And got into Yale Law School and everywhere else pretty much that I applied. Ended up going off to law school, and 3 years later, the last year of law school, I interned for the Los Angeles DA's office, loved the work. And I distinctly remember on the last day of that internship, the lead DA in our office sitting me down and saying, "You're amazing on your feet. You're a great debater. We need people like you. You got a job here, and I think you'd make a great sex crimes prosecutor if you joined us after you got your sea legs under you." And I looked at him and said, "With due respect, thanks for the offer. I've got 6 digits of law school loans to pay back
Yeah.
and a number of white shoe law firms, which are the best of the best law firms in the world, giving me offers, and maybe I'll come back." And he just knowingly smiled, knowing that the golden handcuffs were going to probably, enclasp me and enslave me, and he'd never see me again. And that was then. And I always felt very bad because I had an interest in, I was always somebody who stood up for the underdog. I hated people who took advantage of folks. I hated people who didn't have a voice, not being able to get a level playing field and get their side known. I mean, I was just wired to stand up. I had a very chaotic upbringing in certain respects, and I learned early on that you don't turn the other cheek to tyranny, because as often as not, it goes worse from that point forward, not better. So that was just sort of in my makeup. And I went to work for the law firm. I worked for Fortune 500 companies doing federal and state litigation, multi-million dollar cases for many, many years. And then, I had a kid, and I didn't want to see that kid for 10 seconds every day. So helped my husband with his practice. We sold that practice in 2013, traveled to Australia. We're planning to go through Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia. Got bored like you. I had never not worked in my life,
Mhm.
reached out to anti-trafficking nonprofits in that part of the world, and got an offer to sit down at a Vietnamese meeting with some anti-slavery organizations that were trying to get their arms around the trafficking problem in Vietnam. Came home with a job as their general counsel, never looked back, just absolutely loved the work.
Wow. So when you were working, so you did not actually take the LA job to work in the
No,
sex crimes. So you,
I I
okay.
I interned for a year doing jury trials and putting cops who had, caught the white cocaine baggie as the bad guy was fleeing down the freeway, and putting those guys on the stand and taking jury trials. But after that point, I didn't do any more with the DA's office in that context. Of course, for the last 10 years, I've worked hand in glove with cops and prosecutors in Orange County and elsewhere, federal and state police, military police, on anti-trafficking work. But there was a big gap between 1994 and 2013.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so because I'm curious, but maybe you've had the experience now of what sex crimes that are being prosecuted in the United States look like compared to the trafficking issue around the world. If there's, if they're focusing on it at all here in the United States, if the problem here in the United States is that big, what the I think a lot of people, and the reason I ask is because so many people believe that when they think of child sex trafficking, they do envision around the world, poor countries. They don't envision the United States. So I don't
Yeah.
know if you could answer that question just quickly off the top of your head before we get into your experiences.
Trafficking is everywhere. And I often tell the church going grandmother who lives in a town of 300 people, "Does your town have a motel or a hotel?" And they usually go, "Yeah, no matter how small the town is nowadays, most have at least a motel." And I say, odds are, even in your small neck of the woods, then you've had some trafficking or some underage girls being run for sex, even in your small town. It is a pervasive problem, not just in America, but worldwide. Currently, there are 40 million people enslaved, which, as you know, living in California like I do, that's basically every person in California waking up in some form of slavery tomorrow. And it's a $150 billion a year industry. But the primary difference between the sex trafficking markets we see in Asia, Southeast Asia, where I do a lot of work, and here in America, is it's just a lot more overt. You can walk into a karaoke bar slash bar brothel, or a hotel slash brothel in Thailand, in Cambodia, in Laos, in Myanmar, and you can order up, oh yeah, I think I'm going to order a burger and your local Bud Light, whatever it is, and number 15. And number 15, of course, is a girl. And you enjoy your burger and your fries. And when you're done with your beer and your karaoke, you go into a back room and do what you will with that child. So it is not that easy in America to procure a child for sex in terms of how overt it is.
Mhm.
But since the explosion of cell phone technology, all you have to do is wait for your wife to go to a conference in Chicago, pack the kids off to a slumber party at the friend's house, and that guy can sit down, order a Domino's, and if he's bored and he's perverted, go on to Backpage, although it doesn't exist anymore, Craigslist or whatever the new ones are, and order a girl to be delivered to his house for a couple hours. So it is everywhere, but it is more in your face in third world countries.
Wow. Okay, so you got involved when you were living in Australia, and then you ended up working for the government of Vietnam. Is that who hired you?
No, it was really odd. We were traveling in New Zealand. I mean, I had probably called and actually gone and knocked on hundreds of doors in Sydney, Australia during the couple months we lived there. And the response was uniform. These people would listen to me or look at me and they'd go, "Wait a second, you're a white soccer mom with an 8-year-old kid and your husband in tow who's traveling for 6 months and you want to do good, click." I
Yeah,
mean, it's just, I'm like, you would think they'd be like, I'm smart. Maybe I haven't worked in the field before, but I've got transferable skill sets.
right.
I thought they were going to be grateful for the help, but no. But we were in New Zealand and we had New Zealand cell phones, and the only people who really knew our numbers were our parents, in case of an emergency. And I'll never forget, my phone rang and it was a 714 number, which is the prefix, of course, the area code for Orange County. And it wasn't one of our parents. And I picked up and it was a wife of a man who had adopted two Vietnamese orphans. They owned restaurants here in Orange County, but they felt bad they couldn't adopt more orphans, so they opened Vietnamese orphanages, and they were seeing sex trafficking in some of their rescued youth that would pass through their orphanages. And they happened to be talking to friends at church, I think it was Mariners or Saddleback here in Orange County, and those friends were pastors who'd moved to LA from Australia and started an anti-sex slavery nonprofit when they were in Greece and realized how many girls were being trafficked. And so the two of them were getting together and they were going to take some meetings with the prime minister or whatever of Vietnam. And they just happened to call and invite me to Da Nang, Vietnam on May 23rd. But it was we all looked at each other when we met in the hotel lobby in Da Nang and we're like, this is so bizarre. We should be meeting in Orange County, right? How, and but it was what it was. We all ended up meeting for the first time in Asia, and we came home with our marching orders of how we could service and be of use to the Vietnamese government. And I volunteered my time for the rest of our trip through Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, and just did work on their behalf and then came home with a paid position. But we were working side by side with the Thai and Vietnamese governments, but I
Mhm.
wasn't working on the payroll of those
Okay,
governments.
but the governments are aware, and they're actually trying to do something
Oh,
about
yeah.
this.
Yes, particularly since the Trafficking in Persons report started being a thing some years back, which rates countries by how good or bad their trafficking problem is and the response to that problem. America has a lot of trafficking just because of our size and our numbers, and some states do a lot better than others in addressing those issues. But there are third world countries that aren't, they're wide open for trafficking, and there's no law enforcement response, and they rank them on a three-tiered system, with the idea being that if you rank on the bad tier, the bigger countries and superpowers can do things to force your compliance by interrupting trade, not giving you aid if there's a hurricane, things like that. And so it's dragged even the countries that didn't want to get involved in the fight sort of onto the right side of the equation by forcing economic sanctions if they don't start cracking down on trafficking.
Interesting. So, do you think that works? So, and I ask this because this topic is politicized. It's interesting you're saying what you're saying, because that is more of a neoliberal way to deal with a problem, and it's countries imposing their morality on other countries and saying we're going to economically harm you if you don't go woke in a way. Like, I mean, do you see what I'm saying? Where it's a do what we want with your life choices. This is not about our economic relationship
Right.
with one another. This isn't about
Right.
war with one another, but we just think you're doing something really abhorrent and wrong and immoral, and we want you to change your behavior, and we're going to
Yeah.
strong arm you into it. A lot of people are against that when it comes to things like like ESG scores for companies. That's kind of a similar thing, right? You're saying that these countries are being scored based on this one thing, and ESG scores are kind of a similar idea. Or the fact that there's the WHO is putting together a pandemic treaty, and all these countries have to sign it.
Yep.
And these are kind of similar concepts, but being utilized in a different way.
Yeah.
In your
True.
experience, do you find that that works in this particular instance?
Economic sanctions and hitting somebody in the pocketbook, whether it's the average Joe on the street or a small business or large business or a country, typically always work. I don't care if you're a criminal enterprise or a for-profit enterprise. The world goes round based on money, the buying and selling of goods, the exchange of money as our currency. So if you hamstring the money line of any entity or any large or small country, yes, eventually you may force their hand on whatever it is that is the topic du jour, if you will. Do I agree with it? Well, depends on the day. Of course, nobody likes to be on the receiving end of that. On the other hand, from a free market perspective, nobody is forced to give aid to a country if they have a hurricane. Nobody is forced to do business, or should be forced, in my mind, to do business with somebody they disagree with. In the same realm that I don't necessarily need to serve as a customer, I don't like as a small business owner. I don't necessarily think that I should be forced as a country to give aid based on a natural disaster. So to say that a country has the right to do business with whom they please, again, I can see the wisdom of that from a you're not going to tell me how I'm going to spend my dollars kind of thing. Do I agree with ESG scores and the way the world is moving now? Of course not. I don't necessarily think that forcing the hand, and I do appreciate that I'm speaking with forked tongue to some degree on the topic. I would be more a fan. And the economic sanctions, I probably would work if they did it more often. I don't know how much the trafficking in persons report actually translates on any given year to countries actually distancing themselves from the ones that are not stepping in line on the human trafficking issue. But I will say that one of the novel plans that a colleague of mine who was at the time head of in-house counsel for the largest bank in the world, we were sitting around shooting the breeze one night and saying, okay, how are two lawyers who work for banks going to realistically make a dent in the human trafficking market when it's the single largest, fastest growing economy in the world right now? And what we decided is that a lot of these mafias, because all of the trafficking operations at the very top are being directed or run by the mafias, again, are using money to do it. And most of the time, they're taking the proceeds from the mama san at the brothel. And the mama san, after the brothel closes down at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., walks down the street in Bangkok or wherever and puts the money in a bank. And oftentimes, those banks are Chase or other banks that have American offices. And even if they're not, they're banks that trade in American dollars. Every bank in the world uses American dollars. And accordingly, they are required to not allow money laundering in their institutions. Money laundering, simply stated, is the taking of illicit profits from an illegal crime and throwing it into a bank to legitimize it. So when you sell cocaine and take the proceeds and drop it in a bank account at B of A, that's money laundering. And not only are you, the criminal, not supposed to be doing that because it's a separate crime to do that, the banks are not supposed to knowingly allow their account holders to launder money. So if you Google it up right now, I think it was HSBC was hit in 2014 by our Department of Justice with an almost $2 billion fine, billion with a B, dollar fine for, quote, knowingly allowing the Mexican drug cartels and the Iranian arms dealers to deposit money laundered from those crimes into the American subsidiaries. And the DOJ said the only reason they didn't hit them with greater sanctions is they didn't want to destabilize the barely recovering world economy at that point. So we looked at that and we said, all we need to do is get the names of the bad guys that are not known, that are involved in sex trafficking, to the banks, And at that point, the banks are required to look at that name and go, is Joe Blow just a nice, normal soccer dad in America with the same name as this criminal? Or is Joe Blow the actual criminal who's depositing dirty money in the banks? And if they do their due diligence, then they have to actually start flagging and suspending the account, which hamstrings the money line to these mafias. And that is the way that you get systemic change on a macro level. And so that was sort of an initiative that I was involved with over the last 10 years, which does, on a smaller level than a countrywide level, exact economic hits into the pocketbooks of the bad guys and basically cause them to crater from within.
And that works.
Yes. Yeah, right now it is systematized. Thomson Reuters World Check takes the names that we are giving them, 90% of which are not known criminals. So there's a lot of new bad guys getting into the system, which is good. And it is automatically, and not one-off, but automatically systemically relayed to 7,500 banks worldwide, which is every financial institution in the world, small or big. And those banks are now on notice. Either they do their due diligence, flag the account if they should, or they don't and they're risking a DOJ fine. Either way, you've got them in a corner where they have to take action.
So are you expecting, is there an expectation for these banks to be doing their own investigative work and looking
Yes.
into the accounts, or do they only, well, what I'm saying is, do they do that when you give them the name, or are they expected to do that with all of their customers prior to receiving this list?
Both. When they get a hot name that is a suspected bad guy, as it were,
Yeah.
they are instantly required to start doing internalized protocols that a financial institution has to essentially get to the bottom of whether it's just a guy with the same last name or it's the actual bad guy. And once they sort that out, they are supposed to then start taking uh, all sorts of actions vis-a-vis our government, notifying out various other agencies that they've got a bad guy in their ranks, and essentially shutting down or minimally flagging that account so the money's not flowing through it freely. Also, separate from that, the reason when you take your kid to the bank at B of A, Chase, wherever it may be, your credit union, and you're telling your little 3-year-old, it's just going to be a minute, mommy's opening a new account because daddy started a new business, and you're sitting there, and the time is wasting, and your kid is melting down, and you're thinking to yourself, what on earth is taking 32 minutes to open a bank account? It should be like 2 keystrokes. What they're doing is they are automatically required to do due diligence on you, even if you're just a soccer mom like I was for a lot of my life, and find out if your name's on one of these lists. And that is what takes the bank so long to open the account. Not the actual account opening, but the systems talking to each other to make sure that you're not part of the mafia.
Okay, but is there an expectation that the bank is going to be adding names to the list? Like they look at the transactions and they say, oh, this is somebody who's doing bad things, and so we need to now report them to the authorities.
To some degree, yes. If they have credible evidence, then that triggers their duties to actually do their investigative work and report it out. Yes. But they don't, it's not like the banks have a bunch of internal cops running around just randomly checking on Joe Blow's account. Those are usually triggered when there's suspicious activity, when they get separate credible evidence from an organization like ours, or when you're doing a new account opening or a transfer or something like that. There's certain thresholds that trigger those due diligence
Yeah.
dives.
Okay, so similar to the economic sanctions. I mean, I'm glad this stuff is working in the context of child sex trafficking because I want that to end. I think all of us are very sickened by the idea and absolutely want this to be shut down completely.
Yeah.
But like the economic sanctions angle, where it's like, do what we want morality wise or else, because that's being used, for example, with climate change with countries like, we believe you're
Yeah.
not doing enough on the climate agenda. And so you need to, XYZ or else get these economic sanctions. So it is, not exactly an ideal. I just, it can be used definitely in a bad way. I worry about this tactic of it's all about the money in the bank because that to me, even though it's working and I'm glad it's working, it's one of those things where it could be used against anybody. I fear that, okay, so then the banks have to decide on whether or not the person is doing good business and they look through that person's accounts or they're watching. It's like very big brothery. And it's
I see
also,
where you're going. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
and
we saw this with the Canadian truckers. I mean, little old
right,
ladies who give
exactly.
$20 to the truckers are
Exactly.
suddenly getting blacklisted. Although
Right.
the bottom line in my book is any tactic can be used for good or for bad. It depends on the, the person deploying it and to what end. So in my book, the answer to ill-conceived deployments of tactics that are otherwise neutral, which is, hey, I have the right to do business as a bank with people I like or people I don't like. The handle to that is what happened with the Canadian trucker thing, which is, Trudeau announced, along with all the banks, that they were going to start going after these little old ladies. And
Right.
there was a complete backlash the next day. As I recall, if I'm not misremembering this, they ended up, if you followed that closely, because I was intimately involved with the trucker movements, both north of our border and here, the very next day there was a run on the banks, and they actually had to close the banks in Canada a few hours early because people were doing, there was a backlash. People were going, oh, heck to the no, you're going to play ball like that? We're not down with that. We're going to take our money out and put it in a mattress like all the people who come from communist countries do.
Hmm.
And that is the way you force business back into the right lane if you suddenly suspect that they're taking a neutral tactic and using it for bad ends. And that is always the answer, by the way, is mass non-compliance. You don't really need war and guns going off. You just need to do what Gandhi and Martin Luther King did, which is go up to the front of the counter, sit down, front of the bus, sit down, and don't leave.
Yeah.
And do it with enough people and get enough video rolling on it that the world wakes up and goes, no, we're not okay with this. And the good people then force the bad acting entity back into the correct lane.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a really good point because I suppose it's sort of like police. Like we don't want to abolish police. We need police. We need police to crack down on bad guys. But what we don't want police doing is cracking down on the people who are not bad guys and
Yeah.
going after.
First Amendment protesters. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So it's not that we want to get rid of the practice altogether of policing because it can be used in a
Right.
bad way. We just want to ensure that it's being used in the right way. And so perhaps
Correct.
that's the same sort of thing when it comes to economic sanctions against countries or again or the banking,
Yeah.
debanking
Trades.
bad guys,
Yep.
I suppose. Right. Okay.
Yep.
So now let's get into some of the details of your journey in this. Some of the things I've read is that you even had to travel in excess of 100 miles per hour to avoid roadside bombers trying to rescue children. So you're not just doing this from a paperwork legal, you're like in the field. How did
Yeah.
you get in the field and what does that look like?
Well, I'm an adrenaline junkie, obviously. I mean, I like to jump out of airplanes and ride my dirt bike quickly. And I don't know if your viewers know this, but individuals have a set point in their brain that they navigate to by default, sometimes from their upbringing or just the way their personality is. And some people like adrenaline and handling a million things at one time and bet the stakes kind of games. And I'm definitely more on that side of the equation. A lot of kids who were raised in abusive or chaotic households default to that. The crazy making is all they ever knew, and so they go out and they seek it out in their life. And there's positive ways to channel that. Go be in court lawyer, stay away from drug trafficking, right? Go find high risk sports that aren't too risky, right? But you don't want to take an accountant and try to turn him into a Navy SEAL, nor do you want to take the Navy SEAL guy who likes to handle that kind of, bombs going off, lots of crazy, and put him in an office 9 to 5. Both of them will have a meltdown for opposite equal reasons, right? So I am definitely more not the preschool teacher, want to go do exciting, fun stuff kind of makeup. And when I got the job offer from the nonprofit, they were looking to open a Southeast Asia office. They were active overseas in Europe at the time, but the reason for their trip to Vietnam is they were actively seeking to open that Southeast Asia office. So I was nominally hired to be their general counsel because that was my background. I was a litigator, I was a lawyer, and it lended itself to the title. But in reality, and I did do their legal work. I had the plane ride from LA to Thailand, because there's no direct flight, is like 30 hours. So I had plenty of time to bang out the legal work for the nonprofit, which was fairly minimal. But in form and function, what I was actually doing is hiring and vetting undercover former Navy SEAL, former SWAT type assets to deploy into the brothels. They pretended to be buyers, pedophiles. We would wire them up with high definition, low light video recording watches and 007 type gadgets, pens, key fobs, you name it. And they would go in there and they would pretend to be a pedophile who was interested in buying a 7-year-old for sex. While they were in there, they were of course taking stock of how many girls are in there, what languages are they speaking, are they 5 years old, are they 15 years old, are they going to be able to think on their feet if we do a raid, or are we going to have to be literally throwing them over their somebody's, shoulder and carrying them out? Are the bouncers packing heat? Are they wielding knives? That's a very different situation. If you're going to take down a brothel where the guys have automatic set to fire weapons and they're former military versus some 17-year-old who's got two pocket knives in his back pocket and that's all they've got for their muscle. So those are who we were deploying into the brothels. And I'm not quite sure how it happened, but I ended up basically riding shotgun with them on a lot of these types of forays into the brothel town. The pastor we were working with in the deep south of Thailand, just a normal 65-year-old Finnish, balding blonde pastor. And he and his wife had been doing church work in Thailand for over a decade. And they'd realized how bad the trafficking problem was down on the Malaysia border in the deep south. And they started an outpost down there. And he invited me to go. And I, not knowing anything, I said yes, because that's my default. And then I was talking to my husband that night, who was stateside with my 8-year-old daughter and is former military, former Navy or Army tanker. And he said, "Is it safe?" And I said, "Well, I'm sure it is. I mean, the pastor's still alive and he goes down there all the time. How bad could it be?" And he goes, "Honey, why don't you at least look it up?" So I went to the business office in the very nice Bangkok hotel I was staying at, and I found nothing in the English speaking newspapers. And then I saw the business dude, the hotel worker, walk in, and I said, "Hey, you speak Thai, right?" And he goes, "Yeah." I go, "Can you do a native paper search in your native language and tell me about this region?" And he said, "Sure." And he came back in 2 minutes later, white as a ghost. And he said, "Permission to speak freely." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Okay, ma'am, I'm Thai. I'm 18. I was born and raised in this country. I'm a dude and I blend in. And you could not pay me any amount of money to go where you are proposing to go. In the deep south, it is radical Muslim jihad country. We've had hundreds of bombs go off this year. They're going off one a day. There ended up being 330 bombs that went off in 2013 when I worked in this town. And he said, "I would not go." And I was like, "Oh my gosh." So I texted the pastor right away and I said, "Hey, something came up and I don't think I can make it." And then I came home. And 48 hours later, I was tucking my daughter into bed. She fell asleep in my armpit after reading Goodnight Moon. And I was just crying, Kim. I was sitting there silently crying. And I thought, you know what, God? Lawyers like me are a dime a dozen. There's one on every corner, if not more than that. And there are zero lawyers or even anybody I know, lawyer or otherwise, going to this region to rescue children. This is not, categorically not my highest and best use, staying safe in Orange County in my little house. And I tiptoed out of my daughter's room, texted the pastor back, and I said, "I will be there in another 2 weeks and we're going. And I am so sorry that I canceled on you." And we flew into that region. It's in Narathiwat province. We landed, we walked off the stairs onto the runway. He said, "Look at that." And my plane had gone to the end of the runway. It was doing a U-turn and it was wheels up. And he goes, "That is your only ride out. They come once a day. You're here until minimally tomorrow. Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "All right." And we went and got in the rental car and then we're going 120 miles an hour. And I'm like, wow, I did not expect that from like a pushing 70 pastor. And I must have given him a silly look. And he looked at me and he goes, "Do you want me to explain?" And I said, "Please." And he said, "The way they do the bombs is the jihadis hide behind the rubber trees that you see off to the side of the road and they wait for a good looking target car." And I said, "Oh, like a rental car with a bunch of white people in it that look like pastors and soccer moms?" And he goes, "Yeah, or the military or the cops. They don't really care." And then they remote detonate. And I looked at him and I said, "So you're just outrunning their trigger finger right now?" And he goes, "Darn right." And I said, "Keep it on the floor."
Yeah.
And 3 hours later, we were in the brothel town.
What was the worst that you've seen as you've done these ride-alongs? You've seen these children. I would imagine, are they all children? Are there some that are over age? What's
There's both.
okay?
There's both. And it's really sad because I'll tell you two stories. I mean, the mama sans that you think are evil are really just the girls who didn't die. They were trafficked at 12. They didn't get AIDS. They were lucky. They didn't get AIDS. They didn't die by John, violent sex buyer who strangled them during a sex act. They didn't die by their pimp or their trafficker. And they just aged out of being a child sex slave. And now they're They don't know any better. Their families won't take them back, even though the families in Asia are the ones who sold them to the brothels more often than not. They can't go home because they're considered to be damaged goods. And so they're left babysitting the other girls. That's who your mama sons are. And so I went into this work with a very preconceived notion of good and evil. We took a Christian film crew with us into the brothel town that I just described a month after I first started doing this work. And we wanted to interview some of the girls trapped in the slave trade to get the word out. And we had a girl similar to the one, I don't know if you can see her back here in my camera. Her face is blurred, but it wasn't that girl, but it was another girl similar to her. She was 12 years old. She was the only girl who volunteered to be interviewed. And the mama san said, sure, she doesn't, if you're done with her by the time she's supposed to work, you can have her for a half hour. So I'll never forget, she walked across the brothel room because there are no hotels in this town. We're staying in a hotel, but it's not really a hotel. The pastor and I are staying in a brothel because that's what they all are. So we rented an extra room. We've got our film crew embedded there. She walks, tiptoes over the camera equipment, takes a seat in the corner. We've got her face shadowed like the 60 Minutes does to blur her face out. And we asked her, did you know when you got here what you would be doing? And she looked dead into the camera and she goes, I knew exactly what I'd be doing, but I am not unhappy. And my colleague from London leans over and he goes, Leigh, you got to ask it again. Nobody's happy to be in a brothel. Like there must have been something wrong with the translator. Ask it again. So we ask it a second time. And for the second time in as many minutes, she looks dead into the camera and she says the same thing. I knew exactly what I'd be doing when I got here. I'm not unhappy. And then she says, because my 7 brothers and sisters have food on the table, as does my mother, and they're not starving to death. And if you had asked me before that point, do you think it's wrong to sell your child to a brothel? You and I and everybody we know would have had but one answer to that question. But here's the deal. Is it any more or less bad to not sell your eldest child to a brothel so that all of your children and you and your hubby can starve to death this year? Is that a better, higher, more useful end to that equation? So the answer to that question, obviously, there is no good answer. The question we need to be asking is how in the hell, pardon my French, do you get so darn poor that those are the only two options, selling your child or watching her die? And the answer to that question is communism. 90% of the girls in our brothels in Thailand come from the communist country of Laos. And all of the girls in Cambodia, obviously, Cambodia, had their own communist overthrow a few years ago. And the communists come into town and they promise you the world on a platter. You're going to be equal. We're going to live in a commune. Everybody's going to be happy, hunky dory, happy. And they make you equal by making you equally poor and starving you to death. And that is what they don't tell you at the outset. So, yeah, we need to get our arms around communism and not let it take any further root in our country than it already has, unless you want your child to be in that situation in a decade or two or sooner. But yeah, the situations we've seen are horrible. If I may, I know that was a long answer. I have one other story that is very illustrative that I'd like to tell on the point of the worst thing I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were working in country, we needed an office, and our liaison was a Thai business person. And I was talking to him. He allowed us to work out of his business in a Bangkok high rise. And so we're on the 30th floor of some skyscraper like you'd see in LA. And I had just landed that month to start opening the office. And he said, hey, I hope you don't mind, but I hired you as secretary. And I said, oh, mind? No, thank you. One less thing I have to do, right? And he goes, yeah, I think she's going to be a good secretary and a good asset. And I sort of did a double take, and I said, an asset like an asset to the team kind of asset, or like an intel asset? And he goes, the latter. And my brain was melting out my left ear at this point because all of my assets were former Navy SEALs who weigh 250 pounds or 6'5", 4% body fat, and my Thai secretaries are like 5 foot nothing and they're 90 pounds dripping wet. And I'm thinking to myself, how in the heck am I going to have all of these in one body, right? And I must have looked very confused. And he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, I'll let her tell you her story. And I said, okay. So a week later, the girl walks into my office and, we'd been working together for a few days at that point. And she said, hey, I got your computer talking to your printer finally. And I said, oh, thank you very much. And then she didn't leave. She started playing with all the tchotchkes and paperweights on my desk. Literally, it felt like the temperature was getting colder in the room. And I could tell she had something she wanted to say. I'd interviewed enough witnesses over the years, rape victims. I could tell she had something she wanted to talk about. And she looked at me and she said, so I'm what happens when Australian or American men come to Thailand as part of the military and they fall in love with a Thai woman and they marry her. My dad was a mean Australian drunk who married a Thai woman, and I am the product of that marriage. And when my dad would get drunk, he would just beat my mom up all the week long, every day of the week, and twice on Sunday. But that is why I speak fluent English and Thai. And one day when I was 12, they were beating each other up, and I wanted to not be part of it. So I left my little hut. She lived in rural Thailand. And I walked down my little dirt road and I sat on the bus stop. And a few minutes later, a pickup truck came by full of young, muscular men. And these teenagers hopped out and they shoved a needle into my arm. And it must have had a really good narcotic in it because when I woke up, I was in a slave trading camp on the Thailand Burmese border where buyers from the world over at these brothels would descend on this trading camp and look at the product, which were girls between the ages of 0, babies, on up to about her age, 12 or 13. And they'd say, I want that girl and that girl and that girl and that girl, much like you see, in Gone with the Wind back in the day with plantation owners saying, I'll take those folks to be my slaves. And she woke up because they were executing a 2-year-old baby next to her because the baby would not stop crying. That's how she came to in this trading camp. And as if that weren't enough, I kind of thought like, oh my word, like maybe her story is about to end. Because for my part, I was just sitting there dumbstruck. I mean, my jaw was on the floor. And then she looked at me and she said, but we're just so much chattel to them, really. And so one day the guards got bored. And because there's always more girls where we come from, unlike the cocaine dealers who would never willingly flush their cocaine, their product down the toilet, these guards would just periodically line us up and start going down the firing line and shooting us and killing us, executing us. And then she got really, really upset. And she looked at me and she said, and every time they would come to another girl, the girl would grapple for the gun and fall to her knees and beg and cry and plead for her life to no avail. And her voice was dripping with hate and angst and disdain for these girls who begged. And then she stopped talking. And I looked at her quietly and I said, so what did you do when the guards got to you? And she looked at me and she said, I stood up. I stood up and I reached out my hand and I said, you give me your gun. I'm not effing living like this anymore. I will shoot myself, but I'm not living like this anymore. And the owner of the camp was walking by and he actually overheard her and he said, you follow me. And he took her into his little Quonset hut and sat her down opposite him across his desk and said, listen, little girl, I've been doing this for decades, and everybody will beg for their life in the final analysis, no matter how big a strong person they think they are. They will all, one for one, beg for their life. And you didn't. And I want to know why. And for the second time that day, she stood up, leaned over his desk, reached out her hand, and said, I know you have a gun in your desk drawer. Give it to me. I'll say to you again what I said outside. I'll shoot myself, but I'm not living like this anymore. And he leaned back in his chair, rocked back and forth a couple times, looked at her, and went, get out of here. You're free to go. And I learned that day in a high rise in Bangkok a lesson in bravery and courage that I have never forgotten, which is when you are facing a loaded gun, figuratively or literally, that is full of hate and anger and tyranny, you stand up. Because you are better off dying on your feet, if that's what it comes to, than ever living a life on your knees. Tyranny doesn't let you go. You turn a cheek to tyranny, it just gets worse. And so for the last 3 years, when all these moms and dads are like, my husband didn't have a choice and my kid didn't have a choice, and you and I were talking before the show, are they going to bring back the mandates? And you said, even LA County, I don't think is going to fall for it a second time. I say to you this, a mandate is not a mandate. You always have a choice, even when there is an actual gun to your head. And the better option, in my humble estimation, having worked in places that are communist, is you stand up.
The children, what happens to them once they get rescued? Because if you're saying their family won't take them back, what
Right.
happens to them?
So what happens to them in most cases, in Europe, when you rescue a girl, she's often 16, 17, 18. She was trafficked. She was told she was going to work in a hotel in Greece or be a waitress, and it was a bait and switch, and the traffickers put her in a brothel. But she's capable of being put in a rehabilitation facility and vocationally rehabbed. We give her skills, we give her tools, we get her some therapy, we get her, health care, and you can actually then take that girl a year or two later and get her a job and get her an apartment and get her on her own feet in many cases. In Asia, the girls are trafficked. I mean, we're pulling them out of brothels at 7. You're not going to take that girl and teach her how to clean a hotel room and be like, now go off and live your life, right?
Right.
So the game in many cases is to find good, trustworthy families, or often Christian or faith based families, who will foster that child after you have put her in a rehabilitation facility where you teach her about God and human rights and the fact that she's not chattel and she has value. Many of these girls don't understand the most basic premises, like, I'm a human being, not a piece of property. I actually have a right to say no. I have a right to be happy. I have a right to do something other than what my parents or my husband wants for me. And I got to tell you, you would think they'd be so apathetic and brainwashed and Stockholm syndrome by the time we get them out of there that they would be hopeless. And in many cases, you'd be dead wrong.
Mm.
These girls resisted. The reason they're still alive to be rescued is because they were the black sheep. They did not go along willingly. They kept crying and saying no when they were being raped by the pedophiles. And in many cases, the brothels are all too willing to let the non compliant girls go because they're costing them money. They're having to feed the girls who are not exactly good to go in a room with a John because they're crying and complaining the whole time. But even when you do the raids and you take all the girls out, many of the ones that you wouldn't even expect would be capable of being rehabbed are. It's just a longer journey with some than others. You get them health care, you clean up their bodies, you give them something to focus on other than the tyranny that they've been through, and they start to flourish and prosper. But you do have to get them into a safe facility. And in many of these third world countries, just to give you an idea, one of the first things I did is negotiate a contract with the Thai government that allowed us to put the girls in facilities that were under our direction or control. Because when journalists like you, Kim, get into these facilities, the state run, country run facility, which is on an island in the middle of a river, they'll go in and they'll interview the girls, and the girls are like, oh, can you get me out of here? Can I go back to the brothel, please? That's how bad these facilities are.
Oh,
And yeah, I mean, from the frying pan into the fire if they want to go back to the brothel, right? So you don't want to just turn them over to any old facility because sometimes the conditions are worse than they were coming from.
yeah. What happened to the girl who ended up being your secretary when she left? Did she go back home?
She ended up doing a lot of intel work for not just our entity, but a variety of entities. The lockdown was an unfortunate occurrence because we lost contact with so many of the folks that we were, you kind of got to be on the ground to some degree to ride herd on what you're doing. And when you can't fly, it really interrupts the work in foreign countries.
Hmm.
And of course, it's, a wide open doorway for the criminals who can seem to get around the world regardless of lockdowns, unfortunately. But last I heard, she was doing well and she was still under her own direction. She had been sex trafficked a second time between the story I told you and when she came to work for our organization, which is very common that these girls who are don't have the best families or they can fall victim over and over again to traffickers if you don't get them squarely and solidly into good hands the first time you rescue them. So it was good that we came along in her life when we did because she was gainfully employed and by then she was able to be an adult and on her own. But it is a challenge when you're pulling girls out who are very, very young.
The movie Sound of Freedom was Latin America, right? Is that where that was based?
Yep.
Where in and you predominantly worked in Asia, where in the world would you say sex trafficking is the worst?
Um, it's a toss up. I haven't been to the Latin America brothel scene. I don't know it as well, but what I will say, having been in Africa and Asia, and having been as a tourist to places south of the border, brothels the world over are very, very similar. You get into these second and third world countries, and you cannot rely on law enforcement. The cops get off the clock at 5 and they go clock in at the brothel for their second shift where they're working as a bouncer. So, of course, they're not going to arrest the brothel owner because he's the one signing their paychecks, right? So,
Mm.
you've got virtually no law enforcement. The DAs are bad, the prosecutors are bad, the cops are bad. Excuse me, they're often working with the brothels, and you're kind of on your own in these regions. And as a result, sex trafficking flourishes. So it's very overt, it's very in your face in places like Asia and places like Africa. And, when the families are so hard up that selling the child is the better of the two options between that and certain death, you're in a rough area. But I would say, the places I've been, India, I haven't been to India, but my colleagues have. We've done work in India, certain parts of India, in that region, South Asia, Southeast Asia, certain parts of Africa, worst of the worst, worst of the worst.
So then it's not really communism's fault. It's poverty because a lot of these
It's
countries were not
poverty.
communist.
It's
They're very
poverty,
poor.
which is often a result of some sort of totalitarian overthrow, whether it's far right or far left or just
Hmm.
some jerk with a bad plan. But Rwandan genocide, Cambodian genocide, Holocaust. I mean, Cambodia was communism far left, Holocaust was fascist far right, but they all in their wake leave abject poverty that forces people into strange solutions. Sometimes the only solutions. When we go into Africa, there was a feminist who I'll never forget. I read her Red Book article on her, and she said, I traveled to Africa to get my arms around the trafficking problem, and we interviewed the women who were selling their kids to the brothels. Why are you doing it? Well, my kid's going to starve if I don't, just like in Asia. And when I said, well, why are your kids going to starve? This lady said the answer she got back is, well, because every few years the elephants go herding and running through our villages and trample our fences and knock down our fences and eat our crops, and then we're starving again every 2 or 3 years, and so we end up selling a family member. And the closing sentence of this article was, never ever ever did I think when I traveled to Africa that the answer to the sex trafficking problem is going to be electric fences. And that's what they did. She went and raised money to get electric fences for the villagers so they could protect their crops from the wild animals and not have to sex traffic their own children. And you've got to not be a know best when you walk into these countries. You have to listen. These people are on the ground. They know more about their situation than you do. You have to find out, is poverty the driving mechanism? 100% of the time, in my experience, it is. But it might be poverty because the elephants are crashing their fields,
Right.
or it might be poverty because they just got out of the Cambodian genocide. You don't know
Right.
until you ask the question. And then you need to start solving the poverty problem, which will trickle down to solving, as just a natural corollary, the actual trafficking issue.
Yeah.
And you need to teach your boys not to buy people for sex because, quite frankly, nobody would be trafficking children if all of these buyers were buying heroin and cocaine and illegal arms instead of people for sex. That's the other half.
Right, right. Because even if you do solve the poverty problem, you still might end up with the guys that inject the stuff in the girl's arm and takes her, kidnaps her for
Right.
sex. And
Yep.
but I think you bring up something really, really interesting. And a lot of people assume that sex trafficking involves kidnapping, somebody being forcibly taken away. And at a lot of times, what you're saying is these girls are willing, like the young girl that you interviewed who said, I'm here and I'm happy. My family's fed. I'm doing this essentially willingly, allowing herself to be abused because she knew that it was for the betterment of her entire family.
Yes.
At that, there's a lot of argument right now on the internet actually in regards to just even like Andrew Tate and whether or not he was sex trafficking girls. There's like this debate going on, and one of the arguments that I keep seeing over and over is, well, these girls didn't seem like they were chained up and kidnapped, and so therefore it can't possibly be. Not saying whether it was or wasn't in that particular case. That's just the argument I kept seeing over and over, and my thought was, well, that's not, I mean, the majority of the sex trafficking that I knew about when I was working with Stop Child Trafficking Now was the people that were the slaves in America. We focused mostly on American girls. um, you would never know it. I mean, they're in high school. They're right sitting alongside you in classrooms. Their families oftentimes have no idea. Also, they're at home. They're sleeping in their own beds
Right.
oftentimes, and then they're being forced or
Trafficked.
manipulated usually manipulated into
Yep.
believing they have to do this thing when they're called upon, or something bad will happen, or they're told.
100%.
And because they're young and naive, they believe this, right? They're not like, yeah,
You raise an absolutely excellent point. Even in Asia, it's a complex web. You've got the victim who may be happy because she'd rather be alive than starving, right, and helping her family. That's obviously a unique to third world country kind of problem. But even here in America, the girls are often, it's not what you expect. The Taken, Liam Neeson movie, the gorilla pimping, the
right.
kidnapping, we call it gorilla, taking him on the street into a panel van. Yes, it happens. Stranger danger is real. Teach your children well. But Romeo pimping, which you kind of touched on, a lot of the girls, people, I hear it all the time. They're these women who look like you and me, and they're like, well, that would never happen to me or mine, right? And
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, not so quick, because Romeo pimping is the main way in America that these girls are
Yeah.
recruited. And you have a good looking guy who's very clean cut. He's 22 years old, but he looks like he's 16. He enrolls in high school, and
Yep.
he falls in love with your daughter, and he comes and takes her on dates, and he has her home by curfew, and he shakes your hand and looks you in the eye, and this goes on for months.
Right.
And then one day he says something. This is where they start to turn it, right? Something like, hey baby, I know we've been in love for a couple months, and remember when my dad lost his job a few months ago and my buddy was kind enough to lend us some money for the mortgage? Well, that debt is now due, and I still don't have it, honey. And but he said if you just got with him, that he'd erase the debt. And the girl's like, what do you mean? But I love you, and la la la. No, of course not. And but he works on her and
Right.
works on her, and she's young and insecure, like all girls are at some point in high school, for a day or a week or a month. And finally, he talks her into getting with his friend. Usually during that time, unbeknownst to her, in many cases, they are filming her or taking photos,
Yep.
and she's naked. And so 2 nights later, he comes to her and goes, okay, after I bring you home at 10 o'clock, you're going to climb out your window at 11 when your mom and dad are safely asleep, and we're going to go to a party, and you're going to get with some more of my friends. And she's like, the hell you say? Like, no, I'm not. And he goes, yeah, you will. And she goes, no, I'm not. And he goes, yeah, you will, or I'll take these photos and I'll send them all over your high school and to your church pastor and
Yep.
your mom and dad. And all of a sudden, you have a 4.3 GPA kid, D1 volleyball recruit in every AP class that the high school offers, who is being trafficked from midnight till 4 every night. And she's losing weight and she won't engage with you anymore. And you're wondering why she's getting anorexic and none of her friends can get through to her. Guess what, folks? Your child may be being sex trafficked and you may be none the wiser. That is often how it goes in America.
Yeah, I've heard that story over and over and over when I was working with child sex trafficking now. Stop child sex trafficking now. That was the exact scenario. It was always the lover boy method. The guy would get the girl to fall in love, and then he would say, "If you don't do this, I'm going to die." They're threatening me, or they're threatening my dad, or and then the girl, "Oh my gosh, I have to help you, and I love you, of course. Okay, I'll do it this one time." And then it's exactly that. It's the blackmail, and it's not chains. There's no kidnapping involved. They're still sleeping in their beds. Their parents have no idea. One girl I spoke to, she said the only thing that saved her, that got her out of it, is thank God her dad was working for a company that transferred him. And she had to move. I mean, that was it. She had to move to a different part of the country. And
Yeah.
that's ultimately what got her out of the situation. And her family had no idea she'd been trafficked for 2 or 3 years, that
Yeah.
this was going on, having to climb out her window when called upon and get into the car and be taken somewhere. And so
Yeah.
it's terrible. But it is so important for people, I think, to understand that this manifests in a variety of ways,
It
and that it's
does.
not what we think it is. Like what you're saying, like you think the mama san is going to be this evil person, and these family members must be horrible to sell their children off to this, and they must have hated this child. There's this thinking that it happens a certain way, and the reality of it is that when you're in it and you see that and you hear the stories and you see it in your case, it's like never, it's hardly ever the way that we're thinking it happens.
Right. And that is really why it's so important. I mean, I've made a commitment to really, I've been full time in the freedom fight, like we all have, for 3.5 years. But, my first passion was really the trafficking work. I've made a commitment this year to just jump back into it and start doing more and more educational forums and awareness seminars at churches, at schools, and getting back in. We were training law enforcement. My organization was, I was one of their trainers for federal and military police and state police. And we just need to start doing that again. It's time. And, it's funny. I remember my daughter asked me on a flight on Laotian Air into Cambodia, I think. She was 8 at the time. I just started doing the work. And it was one of those, you know how kids always get you at the worst times. The plane gets all of a sudden really quiet, which planes are never quiet. There's always the whirring white noise of the engines. And her little voice pops up and she goes, Mama, what is child sex trafficking? And all of these Cambodian and Laotian tiny little Asian people. I mean, we were like giant Amazons crammed into these little seats that are meant for 5'3" people, and like literally, but everybody on the plane spoke enough English to understand that phrase, and then all these heads whip around, and I'm like, oh, what do I say? And I look over my daughter's head at my husband, and he's just laughing, right? Because I mean, he has to be married to me all the time, right? The lawyer, and he's just, and he looks at me and he goes, "It's all you. Like I'm out, right?" And I'm
Yeah.
like, "What am I going to say?" So I quick thinking on the feed, I give her the labor trafficking definition, and I'm like, "Well, honey, there's all these factories in third world countries, kind of like the ones we're going to, and they make your t-shirts and your shoes, and these little slaves that are 8 years old, they never get to go to school, and they have to work in the mines or work in the factory, and they never get a day off, and they never get school, and they never get friends and recess, and they work themselves literally to death making all the goods that we buy." And I'm sitting there silently congratulating myself on like, whew, that was close. And my daughter, very astutely, thinking man pose, goes, okay. And I'm like, I'm off the hook. And about 10 seconds passes. And then she goes, so how does the sex part factor in? And I
Oh.
was like, oh my
Oh.
gosh. Now my husband is falling out of his seat into the aisle. He's quietly laughing so hard. And again, he's just pointing at me like, now what are you going to do, babe? Right. And I didn't have an answer for it. Cambodians behind me everywhere are giggling silently. I'm like, oh. And I didn't give her an answer quickly enough. And she looks at me and she goes, is it like a forced date?
Oh.
And I said, yes, because we had barely had the birds and bees
Right.
conversation. Like the last thing I want to do is a deep dive into sex trafficking and have to get her like 10 years of therapy, right?
Right.
So, but I didn't want to like dodge the question because, I mean, in for a penny, in for a pound at this point. So it was brilliant because she kind of answered her own question with just enough data at third grade level to let her know in her mind that's on the bad side of the equation. Nobody would want to be on a forced date, but not enough data from my end that, I'm going to need to put her in therapy for years.
Right.
So it was funny. I was getting interviewed by a PBS radio show host a week or two after that. And she goes, "You've got to tell our listeners your amazing handle for describing sex slavery to third graders without, giving them nightmares and scaring their parents off." And I laughed and I said, "Look, I'd like to take credit for this, but really it was just me being stumped and speechless for so long. My daughter answered her own darn question." But there is a way. The moral of the story is whether you're speaking like I'd like to be, so reach out to me if you'd like me to come speak to your school or church or whatever community group, whether you're doing it or I'm doing it, there is a way, even at that young age, to give them enough data that they understand people are not to be bought and sold. Little kids working in mines to make cocoa and chocolate and cell phone metal, and Tesla batteries is not okay. And that we need to know about this, but not leaving their childhood ruined, right? And then as they
Mhm.
get up into junior high and high school, giving them gradiently more data and a little bit before you think you need to. Because let me tell you, they're going into 8th grade and they're targeting girls, and you're thinking you can wait until they're 15 to have this conversation,
Yeah.
but no, you can't. And it could be as simple as these are the signs. Your friend won't talk to you. She's embarrassed. She has a controlling boyfriend. She is on her phone all the time. She's swiping out of her app before you can even, she used to just show you and giggle with you on all the apps, and now she's being overly secretive. These are all signs that you need to talk to me, and I'll talk to her parents, or I'll report the issue. If you see something, you know the saying, Kim, from
Mhm.
the work you and I did. If you see something, say something. You're on an airplane, there's a weird looking guy who doesn't look related to the girl, and she's bent over and cowed down, and she can barely go to the bathroom by herself without him looking at her. Tell the hostess. All the airlines, courtesy of my organization and other ones, have been trained now. They'll radio into your destination. They'll have law enforcement at the airport. Worst case scenario, you made a horse's behind out of yourself, and that's a dad who just doesn't look like his kid. Best case scenario, and they were arguing, and you look like a dork.
Yeah.
Best case scenario, you saved her life, and you need to err on the side of caution because the lives are on the line and hang in the balance. And get over your own ego and looking dumb. When you see something, say something. It may be a life changing situation.
Thank you so much, Leigh. Tell us about your book and where people can get it.
Well, the book, as you can probably see, is called Just Stand Up My Fight for Freedom, From the Brothels of Asia to the Streets of America. It's got a 25-page full color section in the middle of the brothels of Asia. I don't know if you can see, but those are teddy bears lining the pallets on the floor of a back room in a child brothel in the region that we talked about that is jihadi controlled. I really wanted to be able to take the viewer there while you're sitting safe and sound in your bedroom or your living room, because I know not everybody wants to actually go with a Navy SEAL like I do into these areas. But
Mhm.
I think it is an unparalleled look into the reality of sex slavery, both in America and abroad. And as well, I tried to leave every chapter, and I weave in a lot of lighter stuff that makes people laugh, because you can't just do all brothel or you're crying in your soup, by the time you get done with it. So there's a lot of light, funny Irma Bombeck moments and some of the heavier stuff. My daughter actually gave me high praise. She came out of the manicurist chair and said, I actually had to put the book down in chapter 2 because I was laughing so hard that my hand was shaking. She goes, I didn't know you were so funny, Mom. And I said, well, thank you. So General Flynn liked it. He called it a tour de force. My daughter, who's 18 and never gives praise out, certainly not to her parents, she liked it. I think you'll find it an interesting read. You can find it on Amazon, but if you would, I'd rather you buy it from my website, because I make zero money on Amazon, but on my website, I actually can take all the proceeds and plow it back into the freedom work I do. My website is leighdundas.com. It's my full name, LEIGHDUNDAS.com. Or my nonprofit, if you want to make a donation to this type of work, is freedomfighternation.org. Again, freedomfighternation.org. That is the thing that we are these days. We're all fighting for our freedom, so that's what I named it. My book is on there, as well as some of the work I've done here in the States over the last 3 years, and the child sex slavery work.
Leigh, thank you so much for this great conversation, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure was mine. Thanks for having me, Kim. It's always an honor to be here with you.